Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we are undertaking a deep dive into what is arguably the foundational text on mass communication, political organization, and collective decision-making, Aristotle's The Art of Rhetoric.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. Because when we say Aristotle and rhetoric, I think most people's minds go to a dusty old textbook on, public speaking. But that is not what we're doing here.
Not at all.
Our core systemic question is much deeper. How does persuasion, the very act of moving an audience, operate as a structured social system? A system that defines legitimacy, shapes judgment, and allocates power, specifically within our political and legal institutions.
Precisely. Aristotle's work isn't a guide on how to sound fancy. It's a manual on how the human mind, especially when it's operating in a collective setting, processes information and comes to a verdict.
And that's hugely relevant right now.
Oh, absolutely. Because modern politics, media, the law, they're all completely saturated with these sophisticated persuasive techniques. Yet we sort of maintain this collective fiction, this illusion of pure objectivity.
All right, we actively deny the influence of, say, character and emotion on our most important decisions.
We do. So our focus today is entirely on viewing rhetoric as a rigorous, systematic framework, an intentional, reproducible system for understanding how society makes choices.
We're studying the mechanics of influence itself. We want to move way past the idea that rhetoric is just manipulation or some quick self-help technique. We want to know why those techniques work at a really fundamental human level.
To appreciate the sheer weight of the art of rhetoric, you really have to understand the intellectual scope of its author. Aristotle, born in 384 BC, he wasn't just some ivory tower philosopher. He was a political insider, deeply connected to the power structures of his time.
His life story is incredible. I mean, he spends 20 years studying at Plato's Academy, just absorbing the highest intellectual tradition of the age, and then he leaves to become the tutor of Alexander the Great.
Think about that.
That is a truly extraordinary apprenticeship in power. You go from pure philosophy to directly shaping the mind of the man who would eventually rule the Hellenic world.
And when Alexander takes the throne in 336 BC, Aristotle returns to Athens and founds his own rival school, the Lyceum. His output was just encyclopedic, everything from metaphysics to biology, from logic to ethics.
And the art of rhetoric sits squarely in this foundational body of work.
It does. It provides the mechanism, really, that connects his philosophical ethics, what makes a good man, with his politics, what makes a good state.
That connection is so key. He wasn't just observing oratory. He was integrating it into a comprehensive theory of civic life. But to really get the need for this book, we have to go back just a little further.
To the moment when rhetoric, as a formal study, was actually born. And that moment is completely inseparable from the rise of democracy. Rhetoric and democracy were coeval. They were born together.
Ancient Greek culture placed this immense value on loquacity and competition, right?
Oh, this competitive spirit was everywhere. You can even see it in foundational texts like Homer's Iliad, which was the educational touchstone for the elite. Prominence in debate was second only to success as a warrior. The ability to persuade was inherently tied to prestige.
But at first, that persuasive skill was just seen as a natural gift, something you were born with, like being strong or fast.
Exactly. The whole system changed dramatically with the rise of true, large-scale democracies, particularly in Athens around 460 BC. When power shifts to the popular assembly, the ecclesia, and these enormous courts where juries could be 500 people strong, suddenly, public eloquence becomes a political indispensability.
It's a massive systemic change. I mean, if power used to flow from inheritance or military might, now it flows from the ability to stand up in front of 500 of your peers and convince them to vote your way.
And that created an instant, massive demand for formalized instruction.
So who stepped in to meet that demand? The sophists.
The sophists, figures like Gorgias. They arrived, often from cities like Syracuse, where early forms of this instruction had developed after tyranny fell. They offered to teach this skill, the ability to make the weaker argument appear, the stronger for a fee.
This was the rhetorical revolution, the idea that success in public life could be purchased through learned skills.
And provided by speechwriting experts, these logographoi, for people in court. It was, the original professional consulting class, adapting to a world where every citizen had to present their own case, no matter how complex it was.
But this formalization drew immediate and passionate hostility from philosophers.
Especially from Plato, Aristotle's teacher. He viewed rhetoric and sophistry as fundamentally dangerous. the very features that he believes had corrupted democracy and ultimately led to the condemnation and death of his mentor, Socrates.
He dedicated famous dialogues like Gorgias just to attacking rhetoric, right?
Yes, labeling it as a mere knack for flattery, dedicated to exposing what he saw as the moral and intellectual absurdity of letting crowds rule based on tricks of speech.
So here's Aristotle's crucial philosophical move. He steps right into this tension. He's seen the power of rhetoric firsthand. He knows Plato's deep moral objections, but he also sees its systematic necessity in a free society.
And he concludes that you cannot defeat an essential social system by ignoring it or just condemning it. You have to understand it.
He was determined to make the subject safe for philosophy by conducting the most comprehensive investigation of its underlying structures.
Instead of just dismissing emotion and informal reasoning as irrational features of a flawed democracy, he analyzes them in meticulous detail. And this leads directly to his central revolutionary thesis,
Which is?
that persuasion is not accidental or magical or irrational. It follows identifiable structures rooted in character, emotion, and reasoning. And when you formalize them, these structures become the predictable mechanisms that govern collective decision-making in civic life.
He elevated the study of influence from moral condemnation to a systematic philosophical exercise rooted in a deep, deep grasp of human nature. And that's what makes this book such a powerful lens for analyzing our systems today.
Now we can dive into the core systems analysis, and it really has to start with Aristotle's definition of rhetoric as a techne.
Okay, let's nail down that term techne. It's a crucial Greek concept. If episteme is pure theoretical knowledge, like knowing the abstract laws of physics or geometry knowledge from necessary, certain principles, what is techne?
Techne is a practical skill or art aimed at execution. Think of it as expertise that results in a functional product or outcome. A doctor practices the techne of medicine. A carpenter uses the techne of woodworking.
So it takes principles, like the rules of logic, but
Yeah.
applies them to the contingent, messy reality of the world.
Exactly, to things that can, for the most part, be otherwise. So by classifying rhetoric as a techne, Aristotle is saying, this isn't random. It's a craft with rules and structure, just like carpentry, but its raw material is the human mind, and its goal is conviction.
The universal function of this techne, then, is the detection of the persuasive aspects of any given subject.
It's the capacity to find the available means of persuasion. It's similar to dialectic in that way, but it's specifically focused on probable truths, not certainties.
And the primary focus of the book is on invention, this idea of heuresis. It's about discovering the premises, the arguments, the starting points on which rhetorical proofs can be built.
Yes, you called it an encyclopedia of invention earlier, and that's a perfect description. It's providing the systematic toolkit for finding the material, no matter the situation.
And that toolkit is built on 3 interdependent mechanisms of persuasion, the proofs available to the rhetorician.
Argument, which is logos,
Yeah.
character, ethos,
Yeah.
and emotion, pathos. Rhetoric, therefore, is inherently a mixture of logic and psychology. You simply can't separate them.
Let's start with the reasoning system, logos. Rhetorical arguments are structured through the enthymeme and the example, or paradigma, which is basically rhetorical induction. But the enthymeme is the one that really distinguishes rhetorical logic from formal logic.
It is the rhetorical syllogism, and it is perfectly adapted for the civic forum. It differs from the formal syllogism, which requires every single premise to be stated in 2 crucial systemic ways. First, it suppresses obvious premises.
Why is that a system design feature and not just a flaw?
It's because of the audience's cognitive limits. Aristotle understood that the judge or the assembly member is an ordinary man, often working, often uneducated, busy, with a limited intellectual scope and a limited capacity to follow a long, extended chain of reasoning.
So to present a full 5-step syllogism to the ecclesia would be not just pedantic.
It would be completely ineffective. It's a powerful insight into the practical efficiency of communication. If you want to convince a crowd, you have to leverage their shared assumptions and take cognitive shortcuts.
So the enthymeme is essentially a political soundbite or a shared common idiom, not a peer-reviewed paper.
Precisely. If I stand up and say, this man should be punished because he committed a murder, the enthymeme suppresses the obvious premise. All men who commit murder should be punished. The audience already knows that premise.
So I can skip it and jump straight to the conclusion. It's all about speed and relevance.
And the second difference is even more critical. Formal logic aims for necessary truths, things that must be true, like all men are mortal. The enthymeme, however, relies on premises that are only true for the most part. They are probable or contingent.
Which anchors logos directly in the messy uncertainty of human affairs.
Absolutely. We deliberate about things that can, for the most part, be otherwise. We don't deliberate about whether the sun will rise tomorrow. We deliberate about whether a new policy will be advantageous, which is inherently probabilistic. The enthymeme is designed for this gray area. It relies on accepted opinions, not certainties.
And those accepted opinions, those starting points for argument, are drawn from what he calls topics. You've got the special topics, peculiar to a specific field like political science for deliberation or the definition of a crime for litigation. But then you have the common topics.
And the common topics are the universally applicable arguments. Greater versus lesser, possibility versus impossibility, what's happened before, and so on. They're like universal categories of thought, available to argue about any subject, from philosophy to military strategy. Aristotle provides the orator with an instant filing cabinet of universally accessible points of attack.
Okay, so logos is the architecture of the argument, but it's optimized for speed and probability. Let's move to ethos, the character system, which Aristotle claimed contains almost the strongest proof of all.
And that statement alone should make us pause.
It implies that who you are, or at least who you appear to be, matters more than the substance of your argument.
Systemically, yes, because people process arguments through the filter of trust. Ethos proofs are generated when the speech itself makes the speaker worthy of credence.
And the speaker has to be seen as possessing three necessary qualities. Aristotle is extremely clear about what they are.
He is. Common sense or phronesis, virtue or arete integrity, and goodwill, eunoia.
This sounds almost like a checklist for a political consultant today. Why those three specifically?
Well, Aristotle approaches this from a highly practical, almost cynical diagnostic perspective, he asks. Why do people fail to give good advice, or why do they lie?
Okay.
And he says they only fail for three reasons. First, they might be stupid or lack sound judgment. That's a lack of common sense. Second, they might be perverse or morally corrupt, a lack of virtue. And third, they might know what's right and be a good person, but be actively hostile to the audience's interests. That's a lack of goodwill.
So if you can project all three of those, you negate all possible reasons for the audience to doubt your counsel.
You've covered all the bases. The speaker has to appear intelligent, moral, and fundamentally on the audience's side.
And Aristotle emphasizes that this projected character must be generated by the speech itself, not just by prior reputation. This is where the systematic manipulation of perception really begins.
Precisely. It is the appearance of character at the moment of delivery that matters most. A modern politician doesn't need to be personally virtuous. They need to use diction, tone, and arguments that project virtue, sound judgment, and shared values.
When you watch a political debate and you analyze a speaker's pauses or their carefully crafted moments of empathy,
You are witnessing the systematic deployment of ethos. It's the mechanism that turns information into accepted truth.
it's the ultimate credibility hack, structured and categorized. But if ethos is the strongest proof, what about the most volatile element of all? Pure emotion. Let's move to pathos, the emotional system.
This section reveals what our sources call the key tension in the work. In Book 1, Aristotle condemns emotional manipulation, echoing Plato's high-minded ideals.
But then Book 2 is dedicated entirely to the systematic, meticulous exposition of how to create and manage emotion. It's like 100 pages of psychological analysis.
It is.
So why does he pivot? Is it a contradiction or is it him acknowledging reality?
It's an acknowledgement of system necessity. He realized that judgment is not a purely rational act. We do not render the same verdict when we are angry, or afraid, or sympathetic, or pleased. The emotions of the audience are a systemic input into the decision-making process.
So to ignore them is to ignore reality, especially in a popular court or assembly.
He had to integrate emotion into the technique if the technique was going to be effective. And in doing so, he transforms the irrational into a field of rational inquiry. He's not interested in the philosophy of anger. He wants to know the operating conditions that produce it reliably.
And he lays them out with almost clinical precision.
He does. For an emotion like anger to arise in the audience, three conditions must be systematically satisfied. First, the psychological state. The audience has to be in a state of feeling frustrated or having an expectation blocked.
Okay, so they need to feel vulnerable or entitled to something they are not receiving.
Exactly. Second, the stimulus. There must be an appropriate trigger, which is usually a real or imagined slight or insult. It must feel like an undeserved disrespect.
And third,
Third, there must be an appropriate object. You can't be angry at a force of nature or someone far too powerful to challenge. You have to target an individual or a small group who appears to have the intent and the capacity to correct that slight.
Let's construct a simple modern scenario to illustrate this mechanism. If I am an orator at a political rally and I want the crowd to feel anger toward the opposing party, I can't just yell about the system.
No, that's too abstract. You have to first establish condition one, the psychological state, by reminding them that they are hardworking, they pay their taxes, and they deserve secure, well-funded schools.
Then you present condition two, the stimulus, by identifying a specific policy or a specific politician who actively blocked that funding or mocked their efforts.
Right. And finally, condition three, the object. You frame that politician as someone who could have acted differently, not as an inevitable disaster, but as a small, culpable individual who intentionally disrespected their sacrifice.
By systematically satisfying those three conditions, Aristotle provides the orator with a route map to produce or control the emotion. He put emotional manipulation on a rational, scientific, predictable footing.
He integrated the most volatile element of civic life into the formal system of persuasion.
So if these three proofs, logos, ethos, pathos, are the mechanisms of persuasion, the three rhetorical genres are the institutional settings where they get deployed, determined by the audience and the objective.
Yes. The first, and arguably most important in the long run, is deliberative or political oratory. The audience here is the assembly, the ecclesia, which is the judge of the future.
And its objective is expediency or advantage, what is beneficial or harmful to the state. Time orientation. The future. Deliberation is only about things that are possible and that lie within our power to change.
Exactly. You are either exhorting the assembly to action or deterring them from it.
Then you have forensic or litigious oratory. The audience is the juror in the courts, the helia judging the past.
Its objective is justice or injustice prosecution or defense. Its time orientation is strictly the past. And this genre gets the longest and deepest treatment in Aristotle's text.
Why is that?
Because in Athenian life, litigation was extremely high stakes. The courts had an extraordinarily wide scope, and they often served as the primary arena for political score settling. Winning a lawsuit meant political survival. Losing could mean exile or even death.
And the third is the display genre, or epideictic oratory. The audience here is the spectator, just an assessor of capacity.
Right. And its objective is nobility or baseness, praise or blame. Its time orientation is the present, though it uses the past to praise a figure's achievements or the future to anticipate their legacy. This was the youngest sister of the genres, rising because of rhetoricians like Isocrates who offered these virtuoso, polished pieces to show off their skill.
But its function is systemic too, right? It reinforces cultural values by clearly defining what is honorable and what is shameful.
Exactly. So Aristotle structures the entire art of persuasion around three mechanisms applied across three civic genres. This isn't just a classification system. It's a blueprint for how a complex, open, democratic society attempts to structure its collective reality through speech.
To truly analyze this as a system, we need to explicitly map the Athenian context. Let's look at the actors, the incentives, and the feedback loops Aristotle was diagnosing.
The actors and institutions really reveal the power dynamics. The sovereign body was the demos, but when you factor out women, slaves, and foreigners, the citizens entitled to attend the assembly formed a remarkably tight, localized oligarchy, maybe only 20 or 25% of the adult population.
So it was concentrated power, and it demanded specific communication skills. And those massive law courts, the Heliaea, they were volatile. They were composed of hundreds of citizens, often highly partisan.
And they were an essential systemic arena. The Athenian system made political prosecution accessible to almost anyone who could establish a case. The law court essentially replaced ostracism as the preferred means for conducting political strength tests.
Which created this constant, steady demand for the logographoi. Professional rhetorical expertise was literally vital for survival.
And the sources are pretty candid about the risk in these courts. Athenian juries were known for an overzealous readiness to convict, especially when the defendant came from the more comfortable strata.
They weren't operating in a vacuum of neutrality. They were often driven by resentment or partisan politics.
Now for the incentives and goals. We know the immediate goals: justice, expediency, nobility. But Aristotle connects these explicitly to his broader ethical system. deliberation, the highest form of political rhetoric, is designed ultimately to promote the happiness, the eudaimonia, of those on whose behalf it is conducted.
It links the political outcome directly to the good life.
It does. And the ultimate systemic goal for the orator is rooted in preserving the political system itself. The orator must grasp the nature of the Constitution, whether it's a democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, or monarchy.
Why?
Because fundamentally, all people are persuaded by what is advantageous, and what is advantageous is what preserves the Constitution.
That is the ultimate constraint on the system. You can't argue for a policy that fundamentally undermines the structure of power in which the decision-makers operate. You have to argue for prosperity within the existing framework.
And the system of rhetoric provides the necessary narratives through the process of invention. The topics act as narrative generators, supplying the premises needed for arguments focused on possibility, justice, expediency, honor, and blame. It's how the culture produces shared stories and justifications for collective action.
The feedback loops are perhaps the most chilling aspect for a student of modern media. Aristotle reveals how persuasion shapes belief and reinforces authority. He states that credence is greatest when a demonstration is supposed to have been given.
Let's unpack that. It means the audience doesn't need actual logical necessity.
They just need the subjective feeling that proof occurred.
Exactly. It's the performance of proof. If the orator sounds credible, ethos, and manages the audience's emotions, pathos, and presents a few compelling enthymemes, the audience will walk away with the conviction that a demonstration was given.
And this subjective belief then reinforces the orator's authority, creating a positive feedback loop. The audience trusts the speaker because they felt persuaded, and the speaker is thus enabled to persuade them even further.
This insight also explains the judge's motivation in forensic speaking. Aristotle realized the judge often concerns the affairs of other men and judges with an eye to their own advantage, acting more like someone bestowing rewards than rendering pure, disinterested judgment.
So the judge is an interested party, not a neutral vessel of logic.
If I'm a juror, I am not just deciding the fate of the accused. I am participating in a political act, and I want the decision to align with my values, my group, my advantage. Persuasion, therefore, isn't enough to demonstrate facts. The speaker must capture the hearer's sympathy, the pathos element, to activate that self-interest.
So why does rhetoric remain central even when modern societies claim to value pure reason?
Because rhetoric deals with things about which we deliberate, but of which we have no perfect arts or necessary truths. We are always operating in the realm of probability.
And we return to the cognitive constraints.
Yes. The primary audience for civic discourse has a limited intellectual scope and a limited capacity to follow an extended chain of reasoning. This isn't an insult, it's a structural reality. If you want a society of 500 million people to agree on policy, you have to use mechanisms that rely on commonplaces, truncated arguments like enthymemes, and emotion. It is a necessary structural concession to the scale of human interaction.
Let's pull these ancient systemic observations forward. I mean, they feel incredibly relevant to modern institutions, which are, at the end of the day, just complex forms of deliberation and litigation.
We can start with modern political discourse and the structural role of style. Aristotle observed that the study of style, metaphor, and rhythm developed because of the baseness of the audience.
And that isn't a moral judgment on the audience.
No, it means that as the audience grows, the standard of proof diminishes. The larger the crowd, the more remote the inspection, so precision becomes unnecessary, and rough sketches suffice.
That pattern is terrifyingly clear in political campaigning and 247 cable news today.
The deliberative style, the style of mass politics, is described by Aristotle as resembling a rough sketch because the audience is vast and fleeting. You don't have time for nuance. You must use high-impact language, memorable metaphors, and sharp, rhythmic delivery to leave a clear but fundamentally imprecise impression.
Conversely, forensic style, like a detailed legal argument or an investigative report, has to be meticulous because the judge or the audience is inspecting closely, trying to reconstruct a specific past event.
The structure is fixed. The largest audience requires the simplest, most stylized, and often least precise presentation. We see complex policy debates today that are reduced to three-word slogans. It's the same rule.
Then consider legal argumentation. We strive for certainty in court, but forensic enthymemes rely on the probable on things true for the most part. This just reflects the inherent uncertainty in reconstructing the past. We use evidence to increase the probability of a conclusion, but we rarely reach absolute certainty, especially about human motivation.
And the structural use of emotion in law remains potent. Despite strict rules of evidence and judicial instruction against passion, A large jury is still highly susceptible to appeals to pity, indignation, or anger.
The pathos mechanism precisely as Aristotle mapped it.
The Athenian system was prone to partisan outcomes because the jury was a political body. And our modern systems, even with professional judges, still rely on human empathy and shared moral frameworks that are defined by emotion.
And what about media persuasion and public trust?
Aristotle observed that written speeches, which we can extrapolate to all modern formalized media, have more effect through their style than through their intellectual content. This is the core principle of effective media messaging: presentation over substance, especially if the substance is too complex for the audience to fully inspect.
And that ties directly back to propriety. It's not just about flashy prose. It's about ensuring the expression suits the content and, crucially, the character being projected.
Exactly. A CEO announcing layoffs has to use a style appropriate to empathy and sobriety, even if the decision itself is purely financial. If the style and the projected character clash, say, they use overly cheerful language for a somber topic, the persuasive impact is instantly impaired.
So the crafting of a public persona, the social media feed, the carefully curated biographical details.
This is the systematic deployment of ethos and pathos, ensuring that the style projects common sense, virtue, and goodwill to the target audience. The medium of persuasion might change, but the underlying mechanisms Aristotle identified are fixed.
And this all leads to the systemic challenge to the illusion of rational neutrality. Whenever an institution, be it politics, law, or media, claims to be based solely on neutral facts or pure logic, Aristotle's framework stands as a perpetual challenge.
Because the central persuasive mechanism, the enthymeme, is explicitly designed to operate on things that can, for the most part, be otherwise. Human decision-making, particularly when it's collective, occurs in the realm of shared opinion and probability, not necessary truth. The notion of pure reason surviving contact with collective human judgment is itself the illusion. The system requires ethos and pathos to move the needle.
This brings us directly to the core mission of crisis in perception. Aristotle's analysis directly eliminates how systems structure and shape our perception.
Absolutely. The book reveals that perception, what we accept as true, what we judge to be fair, what we deem expedient, it's not a spontaneous individual act. It is fundamentally structured by three intentional, integrated, and mutually reinforcing mechanisms: logos, ethos, and pathos. They are systematically designed proofs that operate in concert to create conviction.
And crucially, this exposes the invisibility of persuasive power. Before Aristotle, the power of character projection and raw emotion was often dismissed by the intellectual class as random chaos or trickery or just bad behavior.
But by classifying ethos and pathos as legitimate forms of proof coordinate with logical demonstration, he forced the intellectual world to recognize and systematically categorize mechanisms of influence that they previously preferred to ignore.
It's a remarkable paradox that reinforces our core theme.
Essential systems like mass persuasion are often denied legitimacy while being constantly and systematically deployed in public life. The long historical rejection of rhetoric by philosophers like Plato, followed by its uncompromising incorporation by Aristotle, confirms that the most powerful social technologies are the ones we desperately wish didn't exist, but which define our reality.
The book is the crucial bridge that vindicates the rationality of an art that's so often dismissed as mere trickery. Aristotle essentially gave us the first technical language for describing how a free society talks itself into or out of action.
In reflection, The Art of Rhetoric is not a simple instruction manual. It is a profound treatise on the cognitive architecture of collective decision-making.
He shows that effective persuasion requires a deep, sophisticated understanding of the human mind, an engine of extraordinary sophistication that requires flexibility beyond the certainty needed for other practical sciences.
It has to operate in the gray areas of probability, meaning the rhetorician must be a philosopher, a psychologist, and a political expert all at once.
And in terms of democracy and collective judgment, the Athenian model proves that collective judgment in a free society is highly susceptible to persuasion based on character and emotion, not just deductive logic. The orator has to contend with the human mind as it actually exists, constrained by intellectual scope and susceptible to passions, not the ideal mind that philosophers wished they were addressing.
So if Aristotle analyzed how all three components, logos, ethos, and pathos, work together, what's his final, most provocative thought on the optimal timing of their deployment?
It comes in his discussion on proof and refutation. He urges that demonstrative proofs, the enthymemes, and emotional appeals, pathos, should not be introduced simultaneously in a speech.
They can't occupy the same space.
That's right. He cautions that simultaneous stimulations exclude each other and make each other either disappear or become weak.
This insight, drawn from observing the Athenian assembly, suggests that raw emotion and reasoned argument cannot effectively occupy the same cognitive space during a persuasive moment. The effective rhetorician must isolate them, stir the passions, then present the logic, or vice versa, to maximize the impact.
That controlled isolation of cognitive elements might be Aristotle's most enduring and profound psychological observation about the mechanism of human judgment.
We have been diving deep into Aristotle's The Art of Rhetoric, specifically the Penguin Classics edition, translated and introduced by H.C. Lawson Tancred.
This is a challenging but essential text for anyone trying to understand the fabric of modern communication and political life. We strongly encourage reading the book or borrowing it from a library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.